So I'm not going to tell you what this picture is for a few minutes. It's not the rudest picture in the book, but it's certainly the oddest. And my first theme is the rise of sexual freedom. Because the most obvious part of the sexual revolution was the collapse of public punishment and a huge surge in illicit sex. If we look at the middle of the 17th century, at how much sex people are having outside marriage, the figures are very low. Only 1% or so of births in the 1650s is illegitimate. If you look forward to 1800, the situation has been completely transformed. In 1800, about a quarter of all firstborn children are illegitimate, and about 40% of women are already pregnant when they get married. The second striking development is the birth of the modern idea of sexual freedom. In fact, in the 18th century, sex becomes increasingly viewed not as dangerous and to be repressed, but to be celebrated as the greatest and perhaps even the most important pleasure in life. It's an attitude summed up in the great line by John Wilkes: "Life can little more supply than just a few good fucks, and then we die." That's the ethos of the 18th century celebration of sex in a nutshell. It encapsulates what the purpose is of life, that it is to have a good time on earth, and the centrality of sexual pleasure in that. And that poem was written in 1754, exactly 100 years after the execution of Susan Bounty. Now, sexual freedom doesn't come about in a vacuum. It's a product of the social and intellectual transformation of society at this time. In social terms, what's particularly important and particularly striking is the urbanization of Western society. The culture of discipline and of persecuting and repressing people for having sex outside marriage was developed in a society where almost everyone lived in very small rural communities of maybe just 100 or so people in any place. And that's a kind of context in which the enforcement of social and religious and sexual conformity is fairly easy to maintain. But in the 18th century, London, which is at the vanguard of the development that I'm talking about, explodes into the greatest city on earth. At the end of the Middle Ages, only about 40,000 people live in London. By 1800, over 1 million do. It's the largest city in the world. And by 1850, most of the British population live in towns. So there's this tremendous shift from a largely rural population to one living in major cities. And life in towns is very different. Life in major towns is very different. It allows for much greater opportunities for sexual adventure. It puts the traditional forms of policing under increasing and impossible strain, and it provides for all sorts of new ways of living and communicating. In intellectual terms, this is equally a period of seismic change. The old way of thinking about sex that Western society was founded on until the 18th century was essentially fundamentalist. That's to say, the belief that there was only one right way of behaving, that God had laid that down in the Bible, and that all deviations from it should be punished. That God would punish societies if they did not uphold his law. But in the 18th century, people start to think very differently about God, about human nature, about the whole purpose of life on earth. They start to think of the deity as a much more benign and distant figure. They start to think of pleasure as an intrinsically good thing. And they start to distrust the text of the Bible as perhaps not entirely God's word, but an amalgam of all sorts of texts, possibly with human influence. And they start to look for different ways of establishing what's right and what's wrong. And in doing so, they look increasingly to personal conscience, to individual reason, and to what seems natural. Instead of looking to external authorities, to the text of the Bible, they increasingly look at ways of thinking that individuals can determine for themselves. And this leads to a much more pluralist outlook. Now, the consequences are extraordinary. I'm going to tell you about the picture now. The 18th century is the moment at which sexual pleasure is not just celebrated intellectually or individually, but also communally in many clubs up and down the land. And this object is from a sex club called the Beggars' Benison, founded on the east coast of Scotland in the middle of nowhere in the 1730s. The members of the Beggars' Benison are a cross-section of respectable men from their society, academics, lawyers, businessmen, clergymen. What they do is to gather together regularly, to get drunk, to sing rude songs, to read pornography to each other. They hire young women to come and strip off and display themselves in front of them. And then they go through various elaborate rituals for which they have objects like this, specially commissioned. And I'm afraid their central ritual involves this platter. They stand around the platter, they whip out their members, and they collectively ejaculate onto it. You'll notice I can't really look at it myself. It always makes me a bit queasy. So I'm going to flip forward. Because it's not just libertines who argue for sexual freedom and celebrate it. It's not just extreme fringe manifestations like that where we can trace the advance of sexual freedom. It's equally something that goes to the heart of new ways of thinking about theology and philosophy. This, for example, is a man called Matthew Tyndall, great Oxford Don, Fellow of All Souls, who in 1730 published one of the most influential works of theology of the early 18th century, Christianity as Old as the Creation. And one of the central themes of that book is that traditional biblical norms, in sexual as in other matters, are but priestly inventions. They're old-fashioned, they're out of date, they're not appropriate to a modern state. Instead of the rules of the Bible, he says, we should think of morality using reason. Enjoying a woman, he says, or lusting after her, can't be said without considering the circumstances to be either good or evil. That warm desire which is implanted in human nature can't be criminal when perused after such a manner as tends most to promote the happiness of the parties and to propagate and preserve the species. So sex is probably mainly a pleasurable and a good thing. It depends on the circumstances. Or take one of the leaders of the Church of England. This is George II's Archbishop of York, Lancelot Blackburn. I often dined with him, reported Horace Walpole, the diarist, and when I did, his mistress, Mrs. Crewis, sat at the head of the table, and Hayter, his illegitimate son, by another woman, at the end of the table. And Walpole goes on to relate how Blackburn was such a man of the world that he had advised the Queen herself that she was a wise woman not to mind her husband having a mistress. That is the kind of attitude that reaches into the highest echelons of the church by the middle of the 18th century. George III's favourite clergyman, Charles de Gueffardière, similarly referred in private to the Bible as a ridiculous, disgusting mass of precepts that people no longer read, and advised his protégés, above all, devote yourself to women.